everyone. It's a pleasure to talk to you today. I'm Dr. Aubrey Jane Roberts and I'm a paleontologist, a scientist that studies fossils. I'm currently speaking to you from my home office, although I'm usually at the Natural History Museum in Oslo, Norway. I'm part of a research team that goes to the Arctic and excavates gigantic reptiles from the frozen mountainsides. My field of research are the reptiles that ruled the seas while dinosaurs roamed on land. These animals are called the marine reptiles. These animals were not dinosaurs, but just a group of reptiles that had specialized for life underwater. Today we have some marine reptiles like turtles and marine iguanas. Ancient marine reptiles and their modern counterparts evolved from land-living reptiles that over millions of years adapted for a marine environment. The three groups that you see on the image are some of the animals that I study. The ichthyosaurs on the top are a group of fish-shaped reptiles which probably lived in a similar manner to dolphins today, although they're completely unrelated. The pliosaurs and the long-necked plesiosaurs are two closely related groups that swam using their four large flippers. The pliosaurs in the middle were the top predators in the seas and specialized for eating other marine reptiles. The long-necked plesiosaurs, on the other hand, had really long necks, possibly for fooling their smaller prey, such as schooling fish or squid. These animals have been found all around the globe in rocks which were made from ancient seabed sediment during an era of time called the Mesozoic. This stretched from 252 to 66 million years ago and includes periods you may have heard of, such as the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous periods. This map shows the position of the continents during the late Jurassic, about 150 million years ago. As you can see, marine reptiles such as plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs, and pliosaurs have been found all around the globe. We're interested in the top portion, the Arctic. During the Jurassic, the continents were much further south than they are today, and the Arctic included a large sea called the Boreal Sea, and here the marine reptiles roamed, the ones that I study. My work is based on the fossils of these marine reptiles from the archipelago called Svalbard, under the sovereignty of Norway. Svalbard today is about 78 degrees north and includes the northernmost settlement in the world, Longyearbyen. Since 2004, the team I am a part of has travelled to the largest island, Spitsbergen, nearly every year to search and excavate Mesozoic marine reptiles. We were interested in seeing what type of reptiles were present, were there any new species among them, and what their environment was like. In the winter, Svalbard is a frozen wasteland, covered in snow and ice, but in summer, luckily for us, the ice and snow melt in the western and central parts of the archipelago. This is due to influences from the Gulf Stream. As this is the Arctic, the ground is something called permafrost, which means that only the top layer of the soil melts during the summer. The rest of it remains frozen. So at the end of the Arctic summer, the 2 first weeks of August, we pack up our equipment and fly up to Longyearbyen to start our excavations. At this time, the permafrost has melted to its maximum, allowing us to dig and excavate fossils. But how do we know where to look? That's a question I always get asked. Well, we didn't start this story. Our story actually begins with 3 American medical doctors that came to Longyearbyen in the 1930s to study the common cold. Longyearbyen at the time was just a small mining community. These doctors decided to take a hike into the mountains about 13 to 15 kilometers away from Longyearbyen. During this hike, they stumbled upon a fossil which was weathering out of the mountainside, a skeleton. They excavated this skeleton and sent it back to the Natural History Museum in Oslo to be described. Here it was discovered that this was in fact the remains of a skeleton of a plesiosaur, one of these long-necked marine reptiles. On the right-hand side, you can see the tail of the specimen, and on the left-hand side, you can see the flippers and the hips. This discovery didn't start a gold rush of fossil excavations in the Arctic. It wasn't, in fact, until the early 2000s that a field trip from the University Centre in Svalbard found more bones. They found remains of a skeleton on the mountainsides, not too far from where the doctors found the specimen in 1931. They reported this to paleontologists at the Natural History Museum in Oslo, and so our story begins. Professor Jørn Hurum at the Natural History Museum formed a team that started to plan and complete the largest scale excavations in Svalbard ever performed. Over 8 field seasons working on these Jurassic rocks, the team consisting of researchers, students and volunteers excavated nearly 60 specimens of Jurassic marine reptiles, as well as discovering much about their environment and the other life that lived in the seas at this time. This was to give us a complete picture of how these animals lived, hunted and survived in the Jurassic. This research included describing and naming many new species of marine reptile, many of which are not found elsewhere. And these images show some of these. But how did we excavate these giant specimens in less than 2 weeks? Some of these specimens are the size of a large pickup truck. I'll show you what our fieldwork is really like. It is not clean, it's not comfortable, it's quite cold and often quite dangerous, but we love it. We usually camp high on the mountain slopes, close to our dig sites. We have our sleeping tents, green and red and yellow that you can see, as well as a white mess tent. This is where we eat, talk and discuss our plans and finds. We have to have our camps high up on the mountainside and not eat where we sleep due to the locals, the polar bears. Our team is especially trained in firearms for protection against these animals, but we do everything that we can to avoid a situation where we come close in contact with a bear. This means having a tripwire system around our camp, polar bear watch shifts, and not cooking proper food. Instead, we live off dry tech, dehydrated meals that we rehydrate with hot water. In the many years which we have run our expeditions, we have not really come in any close contact with any bears, although we have seen them from afar. When we first scope a mountain area out, we move across the mountainside in a line, searching for white bits of bone. These look very different from the shale that they've weathered out of and are easy to spot. However, if we are unsure, we can always lick the pieces of bone, as bone will always stick to your tongue, whereas rock and shale will not. Once we find bones, we'll follow the bone fragment trail uphill until we find the source. Our first trips prospecting the area showed that this place was indeed one of the richest localities in the world for finding marine reptiles. Here you could stand on one skeleton and throw stones to the next. This is very unusual. As for many expeditions, it can take 1 to 2 months to find even a single skeleton, so we were incredibly lucky. After locating the skeleton, we'll brush around the areas to try and work out how much of the specimen is there. Is it a complete skeleton or just parts of it left? We try and limit the amount of exposure to the bones as these are very fragile. Permafrost melting and refreezing in winter breaks up the bones, sometimes into millimeter-sized pieces, so we have to be really careful when we brush around the bones. The work digging down to the fossil can be incredibly dirty, and we quite often work most of the day and even part of the night, as we have the midnight sun in the Arctic. It's important to stay hydrated during working down in these really muddy holes. As you can see from this picture, this is actually me drinking clear water. The bottle is just way too dirty to tell. Here is a short film clip of us excavating one of our specimens. You can see myself and another colleague working with a drill and a pickaxe, whereas the rest of our team is currently working on the rest of the specimen, completing something that we call a plastic jacket. And I'll explain how we do that. Most of the time, these specimens can be 10 to 12 feet long, or if not even more. And so we have to split them into different parts so we can excavate them, as the helicopter can only really lift up to a ton in one go. As such, we have to split them up. Here you can see 2 volunteers separating a neck of a plesiosaur into 2 different parts. The vertebrae are removed and labelled so that we can put them back in the lab. This is quite a hard job, as it is sometimes really hard to tell what is bone and shale and mud down in the excavation pit. Once we've uncovered the extent of the fossil, and dug also a shallow ditch around it, we cover the specimen in wet toilet paper, preferably the expensive multiply stuff. This forms like a paper mache covering on top of the specimen to protect it. Then we cover it in plaster. We use something called burlap netting to help make a nice, secure plaster covering called a plaster jacket. We often add in bits of scraps of wood and metal to help strengthen it. However, plaster doesn't dry very well in cold and wet conditions. Even in August, the temperature on Svalbard can drop below freezing. As such, the team members quite often have to hold the plaster in place while it dries. Awkward though this may look, it's actually quite a nice job. When the plaster dries, it heats up and warms your cold, wet hands. Once we've made the first part of the plaster jacket, we need to remove the rock from beneath. This we do with massive chisels that we hammer underneath the specimens. Lucky for us, the ground is usually frozen and it keeps all of the bones and rocks inside the plaster jacket. Then we tie ropes around it and use manpower to flip it over. Then we cut back the excess and plaster. The jacket then gets stacked and transported by helicopter to Longyearbyen. But we didn't just collect the marine reptiles during these field expeditions. We also examined the remains of other marine life in the rocks. This included invertebrates, animals without backbones. The seas were rich in different types of cephalopods, squids and their relatives. As an example here, we have ammonites on the top left. These were squids that lived in coiled shells as houses. And they're also really useful for us in dating our layers. There's also many fish and different types of bivalves and marine snails. We even found a storm layer, which means that it was a lot of sediment that was settled on the seafloor after a really big storm. In this special layer, we found hundreds of beautifully preserved echinoderms, meaning starfish, bristle stars, and urchins. These are rarely preserved normally, and it showed us that the sea life was pretty much richer than we previously anticipated. Finally, we also uncovered the remains of methane seeps, which are underwater gas vents, which even today provide a lot of nutrients to surrounding life, such as fish, squid, shells, marine snails, and other animals. Our team over the years has described many new species of ichthyosaur, plesiosaur, and a new pliosaur. I thought I'd highlight some of these to you. The most impressive, of course, is Pliosaurus fincae, our giant predator and pliosaur. We found 2 specimens of this type, and it was definitely the largest predator in these seas. It was about 10 to 12 meters long, had teeth the size of cucumbers. Here you can see an image of one of the paddles of one of these giant animals with a 4-year-old girl for scale. This beast was huge and could have swallowed an adult whole. And we only found 2 specimens of these because these are top predators and they're usually rarer in ecosystems. My favorite specimen, however, is the long-necked plesiosaur nicknamed Brittney. All our specimens have nicknames as they're easier to say than the specimen number. Brittney is a long-necked plesiosaur, and we named her properly, scientifically, Ophthalmothule creostea, meaning north eye and frozen bones, but I still call her Brittney. She is famous for her really long neck and huge eyes compared to the rest of her skull. Gamla, or Oldie, is one of our best ichthyosaur specimens, and it is nearly complete, only missing part of the tail. As you can see, it looks pretty dolphin-like in its shape, with a long snout and sharp teeth, but with huge eyes, almost the size of dinner plates, that it used to search out its prey, such as squid and fish. But why have we described so many new species? Well, part of it is because no one had really excavated marine reptiles from the Arctic before, definitely not on this scale. So most of the creatures that we found were new to science. In addition, the Boreal Sea was quite isolated during the late Jurassic. The Northeast Atlantic had only started to open, and there were only a few shallow seas connecting it to the southern oceans in the south. This meant that few of these animals could have moved in between these oceans. And as we've seen in many cases, animals that are isolated for thousands or millions of years can evolve into new species, just like the Galapagos finches as an example. Now I've showed you how our excavations work, but that is only part of the story. Once the marine reptiles are transported back to the lab, that is where the real work begins. It can take anywhere between 500 and 2,000 hours to clean, stabilize, and glue each specimen. This process is called preparation. As I said before, the permafrost has fractured the bones, often down to millimetre-sized pieces. And as we have nearly 60 specimens, this project has been years in the making and relied heavily upon the help of volunteers and students to help prepare these specimens. And I thought I'd share with you the preparation of one of our best specimens, my favourite, Brittney. We excavated Brittney in 2012, which was one of the muddiest excavations we did, and you saw some images of that from before. This specimen was special because we realised that we had a chance of finding a skull, as most of the body and neck was articulated, meaning that it hadn't moved after the animal died. Skulls of plesiosaurs are rare because the connection between the neck and the skull is so fragile that as soon as the animal starts to decompose, the head falls off. Luckily for us, Brittney's head had only moved a few centimetres away from the rest of the skeleton. When we got Brittney back to the lab, we started to prepare the skull. Unfortunately, it was so fragile and crushed by the weight of the rock on top of it that we couldn't really remove the shale from inside the skull. So we decided to use CT scanning. This allows us to use X-ray imaging to create a 3D model of the skull so that we could describe the inside parts and even the brain case. Brittney was unusual in the fact that she had really large eyes compared to other plesiosaurs. Maybe these eyes were for diving deep or dealing with the seasonal winter darkness up north. Who knows? We don't know yet, but maybe we will one day. The rest of the skeleton included a neck with over 50 vertebrae. We have 7 in comparison. In addition, we also had a lot of her body and her flippers. Unfortunately, her tail was missing, which was probably already eroded out into the mountainside. Here I have a short time lapse of about 9 hours in total, which shows the initial preparation of part of the neck. From what you see here, we're removing the shale and the rock surrounding the bones, which are in the middle of the image. We remove the rock by using tweezers, brushes, and spoons, and also some dental tools as well. In addition, we also have to stabilize the bones. We do this by applying temporary adhesive or glue that helps keep them in a secure position while we remove the rocks surrounding them. This is the quick and dirty part of the job, and where you see the most change. The most time-consuming part is cleaning and gluing fractures in each individual bone so that it can be handled by researchers or put on display. This image shows the main body plaster jacket of Brittney after the stone has been removed. You can see parts of the limb and shoulder to the left and the belly to the right. The next image is a couple hundred hours later, where we have completed a lot of the cleaning. About 500 hours later, we have the complete result, where it is ready to be put on display. From excavation to when our research paper describing her as a new species was published, it took 7.5 years. Definitely not a quick win, but a specimen worthy of the time and effort it took. So we've taken a look at these Arctic marine reptiles and how we excavate them. But how do we know what they look like when all we have are their bones left? Well, the truth is quite often we don't just have their bones. In rare cases, we actually have their skin preserved, or at least an impression of it. Unfortunately, we don't have that from the specimens on Svalbard, as the shale is too broken from permafrost forces. But we do have it from the other places that marine reptiles of similar age are. Here we can actually see the skin impressions clearly outlining a dorsal fin and tail fin on an ichthyosaur. There have even been cases where it has been reported that fossilized pigment has even been preserved, allowing us to reconstruct the coloration of some of these animals. This work has only really been attempted in the last 5 to 6 years, so it will be amazing to see what the future brings with new technology here and how much more we can learn about these amazing animals from the time of the dinosaurs. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you all to our sponsors and to our volunteers on the expeditions. Thank you.